Hi, my name is Kai Struble. I'm a program manager in Azure Security, and I work on access control and transparency.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sandeep Kalarikal. I'm a principal program manager with the Azure Security team. I primarily focus on the access control area for Azure production systems, and I'm also the product manager for customer Lockbox. Today, we are going to talk about data protection and transparency in Azure. Let's take a quick look at the agenda and what we are going to cover in this session today. This session is primarily going to focus on two aspects around data protection. That's visibility and control of customer data that's stored in Azure. We will talk about customer Lockbox and its workflow, as well as the auditing and the transparency features that we are going to announce. All of Microsoft services or within Azure are designed around the core privacy principle that customer owns their data. Microsoft will never use your data for marketing or advertising purposes. When customer is deploying a workload in Azure, customers gets the flexibility to choose the region where they want to deploy this workload, as well as Microsoft or Azure provides a host of security controls that customers can use to protect the data. We also have GDPR compliance applied across the board for all regions and for all services. We also have that controls implemented to delete and remove data when you leave Microsoft, when you are actually taking the workload out of Azure or Microsoft. Now let's zoom in a bit into Microsoft's commitment to privacy. For this session, we are going to focus on the access control and the transparency piece and the controls that you as a customer has and what we provide as Microsoft around the scenarios where Microsoft engineers access customer data. There are strong privacy protections implemented to control access to your data. And we have features like customer Lockbox that provide customer the control when Microsoft engineer access customer data. There are also controls around encryption as well as confidential computing features that provides capability where you could use encryption features to encrypt the data using customer managed keys, as well as use actual confidential computing features to protect your data when the data or your code is in use. We also have transparency features that are available, which are as part of our DevOps audit features. Now, we will, in this session, go a little bit deep on the control and the visibility angle for access control around customer data. What is customer Lockbox? What's this feature all about? So this is a feature that's available from Microsoft that provides control for cases where Microsoft engineer get direct access to customer data. Customer Lockbox provides customer with the capability or ability for customers to either approve or reject access requests from Microsoft engineers. These are typically happening when there is a support case initiated by the customer and Microsoft engineer during some rare scenarios require elevated permissions that require access to customer data. The access that's granted when you approve the request is temporary in nature. It is typically valid for the next 8 hours. And after that period, the access is automatically removed. Customers who have a support plan of either developer or above can sign up for this feature, as well as when you look at the logs, customer Lockbox logs are available in activity logs that gives you an audit trail of what happened as part of when the request was created, who from the customer side approved the request, when was the access granted, when was the access removed. So now let's also look at in a little bit in detail about how this workflow, how does this work end to end. So let's look at the customer Lockbox workflow. For these scenarios, this would in most cases start with customer opening a support ticket from Azure portal. This is a step one in the process, which would then create a service desk ticket or an internal ticket on our side, and a support engineer is assigned to the case. In step two, there are some cases where an engineer would require an elevated permission to resolve the issue. So there are a host of tools and services that are available to these support engineers to diagnose the issue. That would be looking at the health of the system, look at the metrics, looking at the metadata. And in most cases, we should be able to provide a response back to the customer with a resolution or a path to resolution detailing out the steps that the customer need to take. However, there are cases where an engineer requires elevated permissions. Now, these permissions also in most cases will not result in getting access to customer data. A good example that we can talk about is that, let's say that there is an issue with a virtual machine and the customer wants to increase the amount of computing power or memory, and customer is not able to do so. An engineer might be able to help there execute an operation to increase the number of cores and increase the memory of that virtual machine. However, that wouldn't result in getting access to customer's virtual machine or the data stored in that. So those cases also a temporary access request is created by the engineer and that access is granted, which is temporary in nature. However, there are some rare scenarios that would result in engineer requesting an access level that would grant direct access to customer data. Now, there are also a set of additional controls that are implemented in the step 2. Engineers are provided with a secondary identity. So they use a different identity from their corporate credentials to connect to Azure production environment. We also have multi-factor authentication enabled by default, and that's mandatory. So the engineer will have to authenticate using a second factor to log into this system. We also have enforced a clean device from where the request needs to be generated. Internally, it is called as a secure admin workstation, which is a lockdown device that do not provide any access outside of Azure production environment endpoints. Engineers also cannot have admin privileges on those machines. So those are the host of security controls or baselines that are implemented when the step 2 happens, where an engineer is trying to request access to Azure production environment. When a request is getting created, which is called as a customer lockbox request, that will result in access to customer data. There is a check that is done at the access request layer. It'll, for most cases, will go for a secondary or a primary approval from a internal Microsoft manager or the lead of that process. After which we move to step 3, where customer is now notified that there is a customer lockbox request pending for their review and approval, or customer can then choose to reject as well. There's a notification email that goes out, as well as the customer will be able to now see a customer lockbox request pending in the customer lockbox blade from Azure, where customer can log into that blade from Azure portal. By default, the owner of that subscription, or the user who is in the owner role of that subscription underneath which the workload is deployed, is notified and set as the approver for that particular lockbox request. Customer will be able to review that lockbox request and take a look at the resource what we are requesting access to. If it was generated as part of a customer created case, then we will also provide the details of the customer case that was created, so that the approver can verify why this request is getting generated, and the customer can either choose to approve or reject the request. If the access request is rejected, then the access is not granted to Microsoft engineer. The access request is approved, then the access is granted for the next 8 hours. 8 hours is the most used default time period, but it can also be in some cases shorter or for larger time period as well. This access is temporary in nature and is scoped to the resource for which the access was requested for. In case no action is taken by the customer, the access will expire after, I think it is around 4 days. for which the access request will be valid, after which the access expires. In that case as well, the access is not granted to Microsoft engineer. So that was an overview of customer lockbox workflow and how this works end to end. This feature was released in commercial cloud, I think around November of 2018. In 2019, we announced increase in coverage for an additional set of services. And now I want to talk about what's new in Customer Lockbox. So we are happy to announce that Customer Lockbox is now available for Azure Government Cloud customers as well. This feature is now in preview. And during the preview period, there is a sign up required to enable this feature for your directory or your tenant. So I'm providing a link here that you can use to sign up for Customer Lockbox if you are in a government cloud. We also have additional services that has been added to Lockbox coverage for both Azure Commercial and Azure Government Cloud. There are a set of services that I've just put here. However, I would recommend to visit the link, the Customer Lockbox documentation, where actually I've provided the latest update on the services that are now covered by Customer Lockbox. Now, once we have this, so there are around 20 services that we are now covering for Customer Lockbox, which in scope. Azure has around hundreds of services, if not thousands of offerings that are available. So there is a question that we get back from the customer as to how do the customer know whether Lockbox is applicable to a service or not? And if it's applicable, is it covered under Customer Lockbox, or are there any plans? So we are now announcing Customer Lockbox integration with Azure Security Benchmark as well. We have a new baseline control introduced, that's the Azure Baseline Control 3.13, which talks specifically about Customer Lockbox scenarios where a Microsoft engineer needs to be granted access to customer data as part of support scenarios. So for a service, you will be able to look at Azure Benchmark and see the baseline, look at this control and see whether it's applicable for that service or not. For most of the services, this section is not applicable because that service may not be handling customer data, or there are no scenarios that exist where a Microsoft engineer can get access to customer data. Now, if it's applicable, then it's going to say whether it's compliant or not, and that's an easy way for customers to reference for any service that they are interested in to check and see what's the scope for Customer Lockbox. I've provided a sample here that is talking about Azure SQL DB and how this control has been populated. Now we have talked about the control part of Microsoft engineers' access to customer data. There are other protection mechanisms or other controls or security features that are available to customer that can be enabled to add additional layers of protection. I want to quickly touch upon the encryption and the Azure confidential computing features that are available. When talking about layered encryption, we now have around more than 70 services that support encryption using customer managed keys in Azure Key Vault as part of encryption at rest. It also supports longer key lengths, as well as adding additional layer of protection using encryption using Microsoft managed keys and as an additional layer. If you look at Azure confidential computing, that talks about scenarios where customer data and say customer code can be protected when it's in use by the service. So there are cases where we could create an isolated computation environment using hardware-based trusted execution environment. And I provided links for both here, where you can look at the latest announcements in this space, as well as if you want to know more about these features. And that takes us to the end of the first part of the session. And now I hand it over to Kai.
Running mission critical workloads on Azure, we know the risk of any unsupervised or accidental access. That's why we built a robust access management system. Our goal is to deliver the same control and transparency to you. Sandeep just covered how we include you in the access approval process. Now I will take a look at how we deliver a transparent audit trail for the actions in the backend. Instrumenting proper audit logs and monitoring can be a tedious process, but it is critical to the security and compliance of your business. That's why in the Azure Security Benchmark, we provide clear directions for how to enable the audit coverage and monitoring you need per offering. For example, if you take a look at the Azure Security Baseline for Azure SQL Database, you will see how you can enable server audit logs and leverage the advanced threat protection to detect anomalous behavior. For many of our customers, SQL support is top of mind. They need that guarantee that when they run into an issue they can't resolve on their own, SQL will be able to provide that assistance. In these rare occasions, SQL will provide the commands you need to debug on your own, but maybe you're not able to figure it out. You don't know the in and outs of SQL like our own software developers. In the past, you'd have to weigh the advantages of this seamless support process with your own security and privacy needs. We know the importance of providing audit logs for every production touch. And with the SQL engineer accessing the backend, that would hurt the guarantee. And that's why we're providing SQL DevOps audit logs. SQL DevOps audit logs capture the actions the engineer takes in the backend while assisting a customer under a Lockbox ticket. These logs integrate into Azure Monitor alongside the rest of your Azure audit logs. So in one location, you will see both your own admin activity and any activity we execute in the backend to assist you. You can now engage Microsoft in the debugging process in a safe and compliant manner. As a security conscious customer, you trust but verify. You want to see what actions were taken on every resource. Depending on your compliance needs, you may need to provide that audit trail for every production touch. We enable you through Azure Monitor to achieve both in a painless and automated manner. For your own system administrators, you are already collecting audit logs into Azure Monitor for every change made. Internally, we have always had a hardened audit trail for changes made to the backend. It was important to us that you have the same visibility for both scenarios. With DevOps audit logs, we surface these backend actions of our engineers to you in Azure Monitor so you can have the same visibility over our engineers as your own. You can send the logs to Log Analytics, Azure Storage, or an Event Hub to the sim of your choice. Let's take a look at a demonstration of an end-to-end scenario and see the ease of monitoring any activity on your database. So I'm your typical Contoso customer. I have an Azure SQL database here, and I've been monitoring the space used, and I realize on the overall database, I'm starting to run out of space that I have allotted. So you can see right now, this is the current space I'm utilizing, and I'll copy this here for reference. I know there's a table with several million rows, and I know I can delete a lot of that data. So let's see where we're starting at. We have about 2 million rows. Copy that for reference as well. So I go to execute command to reduce some of this space. I'm deleting every other row from that table. So the query is completed, and we're going to take a look at the number of rows we have now. And you can see that we cut the number of rows in half. And let's go check and see if we reduce space. And then here's the surprise. We realize the query didn't do what we expected. We're still taking the same amount of space up as we had at the beginning, as you can see. So at this point, I'm going to switch over to the Azure portal and engage customer support to help me with this issue. So now we're in the Azure portal. Before we start and get assistance from customer support, let's take a look at our Azure SQL Server and the auditing configuration we've set up. So like we were discussing, the new feature from Azure SQL Server is this DevOps auditing blade. So we have this enabled, and this gives us the transparency into what actions the engineer will take in the backend to assist us in this circumstance. So I've toggled that on, and I know I have that coverage and that transparency. So I feel comfortable coming here and starting the ticket with customer support. So here I'll create a new support ticket and describe the performance issue I'm experiencing with my SQL database. So here you can see we're using the same database that I showed in the SQL Server management connection. So I'm going to quickly describe the issue I'm experiencing, which is I tried to delete 500,000 rows, but the database size was not changed. And I'll describe that as a performance and query execution problem. So they're going to ask for a little details as far as what operations we're running, and I'll copy that from the demo just shown. And create the support ticket. So here we can see the new support ticket. We'll follow it in and wait for an update from CSS. So we can see we have an update from our support engineer, and he's introduced himself, and I'm going to reply back with a little more information. So I described the operation I ran and how it didn't produce the desired outcome, and we'll wait for a further update. So I got another response back from the support team, and I can see that he wasn't able to find the issue and escalated the issue to the actual product team, the SQL database product team. So I'm going to sit and wait and see what they come back with. So the support engineer got back to me and they proposed a solution. They showed by running this query, I'd be able to fix it by myself. But maybe in this situation, I'd rather they help me resolve it on their end. So I'm going to respond back and I'm going to say, hey, it'd be great if you're able to help me fix it. Please proceed with the Lockbox ticket. I'm also making a clarification because I realized I slipped up on the table name. So please make the fix to product details and proceed with the fix. And I'll send that over. So I see a response from the support engineer, and it says the SQL product team will reach out to you shortly with a Lockbox request. So I'm going to go take a look at the customer Lockbox blade. And I'll look at pending requests, and we'll give it a minute to populate. And here we see it. So we see the support request ID, and that ties back to the customer support ticket we were just looking at. And we can validate that. And then you can also look at the details. So let's see. So here we have the ties back to the support ticket. We understand the context of why there's a Lockbox request being generated. And we can see that the resource type is that database we were just working on. So the AdventureWorks LT. So I'm going to validate this is all exactly what I thought it would be and give a justification for my own company compliance officer saying, I needed assistance. And approve the Lockbox ticket, giving that SQL engineer access to the backend to help resolve this incident. And we see a final message from the support engineer. So he's reporting back that the SQL product team was able to rebuild the cluster, resolving our issue, and we can validate it on our end. So let's switch back to the database and take a look at the conclusion. So now we're back at the SQL database and we can run this command and see what the space used looks like now. And so let's copy this value in for comparison. And you can see that by deleting 500,000 rows from that one table, we're able to save a gigabyte of data and achieve the goal we were originally set out for. So this incident's resolved. So let me switch back to the customer support agent and finish out that conversation. So that fixed our issue, and so let's support the update the support engineer and show that the issue's been resolved. So now that the case has been resolved, with the new SQL DevOps audit log feature, we can see exactly what was done on the back end by that SQL engineer to help resolve our incident. So in our situation, as we showed at the beginning of the demo, we've configured these DevOps audit logs to be sent to a log analytics workspace. For us, that workspace is called DevOps Audit Workspace. And I brought that workspace into a Sentinel instance. So here in the Sentinel instance, I'm selecting the log analytics workspace I want to take a look at. And here in this first view, you see some of the activity, which is including those Azure diagnostic logs that are coming in. So let's go over to the log view and filter for exactly what activity happened in that last 30 minutes where we're getting supported by the engineer. So we see some activity from the SSMS tool that the SQL DevOps team was using to debug the incident. What we're looking for is what was actually done by the DevOps engineers. And down here at the bottom, you can see the select all command they used to check the indexes, and then the alter index command they used to re-index that table and fix the memory issue. So because the SQL DevOps logs get surfaced into Azure Monitor, you're able to integrate it into any of those automated workflows you have. So for example, when these logs are written to this DevOps log table, you could generate an alert. And maybe from that alert, you have a playbook in Sentinel that sends an email to your compliance individual from your company to review the end-to-end experience. So that concludes the demo. This is a great end-to-end experience showing how me as a customer got stuck with my SQL database. I was able to seamlessly get the SQL engineering team involved to help debug the scenario, and I had full control and transparency. First with Lockbox and granting them permission to be able to help me debug this incident, and then through the SQL DevOps feature, allowing me to have that transparent view of exactly what was done in the back end to support this end-to-end experience. To wrap up, let's take a look at all the topics we covered today. We showed you how you can enable customer Lockbox to gain control of the access of your resources at all times. We showed you how you can gain visibility on the actions taken on your resource through DevOps audit logs and Azure Monitor. We took a deeper look at the layered encryption now available in Azure Confidential Computing offerings. Finally, Azure Security Benchmark shows you the step-by-step directions how you can enable these security features on each and every offering you consume.
Thank you for watching.
Hope we provided some insights into how we approach data protection and transparency in Azure.